All right, let's head over to our Zoom line where we got Mr. Steve Bakken on the line with us, Burleigh County Commissioner, former mayor of Bismarck. How you doing today, good sir?
Good. How you doing, my friend?
Not doing too bad. Of course, I'm going with the flow, if you will, on a lot of different things. I got my renewables ain't doable without fossil fuelables shirt
I
on.
love that shirt.
I do too. So Johnny Green, baby. Anyway, so we're going to go through some cabinet members and how they impact the energy sector. And Chris Wright, of course, the first one to come to mind, Department of Energy. What are your thoughts on Chris Wright? Of course, you're somewhat familiar with him and being in the Bakken, in the heart of the Bakken, your last name being Bakken. Um, I'm very curious to know your thoughts.
Um, Very optimistic. I mean, he's the one appointment that's been kind of quiet so far. I think that's by design. A lot of the deals, a lot of the moving the needle in traditional energy sources, because you and I have had this conversation a lot. I don't refer to things as fossil fuels. I refer to them as traditional energy sources. And um, for me, it's what define a renewable, and coal, gas, oil. It's like all of those. We're making it all at the time. So I think his appointment from somebody who has such an incredible breadth of knowledge in that space and in his previous role with Liberty, I think you see a lot of silence coming out of that office because they're actually getting work done. Um, Unfortunately, the way the landscape's been in politics on the federal level and with the previous administration and um, two previous administrations before the previous administration, it was a lot of lip service, a lot of noise, a lot of grandstanding, but not a lot of substance. And I think what we're going to wind up seeing with Chris is a lot of substance.
Do you think he will get the nuclear industry kick-started maybe under his regime? He'll get one permitted, which would be remarkable in today's day and age.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I'd love to see one here in North Dakota. I've been professing that for a long time, even back to the boom in the Bakken. The number one thing you look for when you're looking at nuclear energy is stability, geologically. And we've got that here in North Dakota. So, from the cooling faction to which is why a lot of data centers are popping up because of the cooling, um, and the stability in geologic terms. Hey, I think we're positioned in a very good place to be providing energy for a large part of the upper Midwest.
Moving on to the Department of Interior, Doug Burgum, of course, home state of North Dakota and right in your backyard. Personal aside, looking at, and or you can go whatever direction you want, but it's like with the guy, from your high school. It's like, do you really want to cheer for him? That type of thing. So anyway, but when I look at it from the Interior Secretary point of view, from an energy standpoint, I think he's going to be very favorable to the energy industry. What say you?
I agree with that. We see that already now with a lot of the leases being opened up, and you're right. I get with Doug, I need to separate personal and what I like to call the fleecing of North Dakota aside. But in the position he's in, it's kind of a position where it's hard to do some damage in a nefarious way. So I think from a drill baby drill perspective, he'll work out in that role.
Of course, he's been positioning himself as a modern day Teddy Roosevelt, all the way down to the cowboy hat, the Teddy Roosevelt Museum, looking to be a reality. That's kind of his baby, if you will. And that's right up against, the national parks. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, is known for national parks in terms of bringing them into America. Uh, what, what do you make of that in terms of how is he going to navigate that fine line of environmental extremists when it comes to the national parks and trying to actually do some energy extraction? I actually believe that is going to be his hardest challenge in the role he's in.
That's a hard challenge for anybody. It
Well,
doesn't matter
exactly.
if it's him or whoever, because one of the things that gets forgotten about quite often is I when we look at environmental activism, it's more about, okay, who's in the best position to be the best steward of the land? So you can have a national park, and what's more destructive? Not managing the forestry resources, not managing the hunting opportunities, not managing um, how that functions in a bigger picture, or okay, we're not going to cut any trees, we're not going to have any logging because, oh my gosh, it needs to be pristine, and then half of it burns down. Um, there's a management side of that. What gets forgotten is we as humans need to be stewards rather than, oh, hey, I feel good because we're not letting anybody touch this. Well, okay, but left to its own devices, there's a cycle in nature of growth, destruction, rebirth, renewal, new growth. And you can do that in pieces. You can't just let it happen on its own because then you wind up losing the whole thing. It's kind of like I prescribe to um, small burns, whether it's politically or, I mean, you've known me long enough, Jason, whether it's politically or not, you can't just burn it all down. And what winds up happening is if you go too far one way or the other, then the risk of burning it all down gets exacerbated. So there needs to be balance. And you're right, that's that fine line that needs to get walked. And whether it's Doug Burgum or anybody else in that secretary position, that's been a fight that we've been having since back in the 70s to a greater degree. So nobody's really gotten the formula down right because that pendulum swings depending on who's political power. Now, I will
Right.
say this, though,
Oh, go ahead.
the one thing that's really interesting is what unites people. And the old adage, politics is strange bedfellows, you take a look at carbon sequestration and look at the varied political aisles that are involved in standing up against it or standing for it. Summit Carbon Solutions proposed CO2 pipeline, and there's a lot of strange bedfellows politically when it comes to that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's common ground. It's finding a place that where you can start to have a conversation for a better outcome. I think the national parks and the federal lands and the ability to drill and manage that, or the forestry side. We just saw what happened with President Trump opening up Montana and saying, "Hey, start logging. We need to be building houses. We need to be cutting trees." Um, there's a balance to that, and both economically for the environment, all different bases are covered. So that balance that's the hard part, figuring out where that line is because people get too politicized about it's all or nothing. It's I'm right, you're wrong, we're not going to touch it, or I'm right, you're wrong, and we're going to cut it all down, or we're going to drill the heck out of it. There needs to be balance. There needs to be some common sense.
All right, next we're going to transition to someone who may be the most important when it comes to oil and gas right now, more than ever in the history of this planet, as far as the United States goes. Planet United States. Listen to me; they're getting all dramatic on you, Steve.
Well, by the time Trump gets done with Greenland and Canada is another state. By the way, I just found out today, and we recorded this a little earlier, but there's actually a contingency from Alberta that is planning to go to Washington, D.C. to discuss, would you please let Alberta become a state? And I don't
This
know
is
if you've
going to be
seen that yet.
fantastic because
Yeah.
tomorrow I'm interviewing Terry Edom from Alberta, Canada, and we're going to talk about the tariffs. And so I'm going to send him a note to say, dude, check this out. Because
Yeah.
remember,
What's
remember
going on with
Terry
this
Edom?
group?
He was the one that was wearing the 9 Inch Nails T-shirt. He writes for the BOE report. He's like some big time author, and he's got the 9 Inch Nails shirt on. So anyway, so the next person I'm going to talk about may be the most important person right now in the world of energy, especially when it comes to the oil and gas sector. And Steve, I don't know anything about this gentleman. Sean Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation. Now he's
Hmm.
served as a congressman from Wisconsin's 7th district in the U.S. Congress for 10 years, serving on the White House Financial Services Committee. I'm sorry, the House Financial Services Committee, and actively leading on local transportation issues via his co-chairmanship of the Great Lakes Task Force. So I love the resume. I love the fact he's from the heartland. I love the facts that he's on the Great Lakes Commission. He understands water. Water is life, the importance of it. My question to you, Steve, is that do you think the average person understands how important the Secretary of Transportation is in the world of energy? Because doesn't the pipeline safety regulations fall under transportation? And of course, they
Correct.
need the oil and gas and the coal to make all the roads. Let's not forget about, the building blocks of the transportation industry, let alone the transportation of the goods and services as well. So your background, you know a lot more than me on this particular subject. So talk to me a little bit about PHMSA and some of those other acronyms that we never say what it is anymore.
So PHMSA is actually, so those pipeline regulations, which you mentioned, they're the ones that run the safety protocols for all of those. So when you're looking at um, what that looks like from a safety perspective, and me as a county commissioner, former mayor, thing I look at all the time, what we're in charge of, public safety. I mean, that's your number one responsibility as an elected official. It's public safety. And PHMSA is really the organization that we rely on a great deal for a lot of those safety regulations when you're looking at an interstate pipeline, whether it's gas or oil, um, or CO2. We've been waiting for new CO2 PHMSA regulations to come out, and that's what a lot of people in my neck of the woods have been kind of harping on is like, wait a minute, before we get into this Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline crap, we need to get some better safety regulations because that was the impetus of why that company was trying to fast track the project was they wanted to get ahead of any new regulations so that they could be grandfathered in because we all know in any sector more regulation is not cost effective, it's cost prohibitive, but public safety comes first. So yeah, that when you start talking about the Department of Transportation and how that plays in with all of that, it's going to be vitally important. One of the things that I'm sure President Trump had had a discussion with Duffy about was what transportation looks like in this country with traditional energy sources versus all of these electric mandates, because those electric mandates essentially on the federal level are dead now. Um, so what does that look like moving forward? Because if those mandates are dead, I'm assuming those $7,500 tax credits go along with that. Now we're looking at an auto industry that needs to completely shift gears. And when you're looking at the big automakers, Ford has lost billions and billions and billions of dollars on trying to produce an electric fleet that nobody's buying. GM to a lesser degree, not as much. Toyota, they went more the hybrid model, which I think has better dividends. Um, so now you're looking at some of these plants having to retool. But did you catch the big announcement The Honda Civic, they're relaunching the Civic with a new model year. They're going to build those plants in Indiana. So, or was it Illinois? I forget which state. It was one of the I states. I believe it was Indiana, and that's where that new plant's going to be. So, yeah, it's a foreign car manufacturer, but uh, it's going to be U.S. parts, U.S. source, U.S. labor, U.S. constructed. Gee, that sounds a lot like Toyota because right now the most American vehicle is a Toyota.
That's an interesting statement. That's it. I was thinking about like John Deere moving to Mexico, shutting down their quad cities, which is Illinois and
Yeah.
Iowa and that area. I think it was Moline is where the plant
Yep.
was, and they're getting into autonomous farming now. They're kind of going pushing the chips all in on autonomous farming, and just two more I want to tie in. Either the Army Corps of Engineers and some of the Homeland Security aspect of it, and really you can put Christy Nome and the Defense Secretary and Homeland Security and Tulsi Gabbard, National Intelligence.
The
Really, there's
NSA.
four or
Yeah.
five of those
You put
cabinet
them in a block.
members.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can put under like American security, if you will.
Because they all
But
have to work very closely together. And
yep,
if one fails, they all fail.
exactly. And and to me, the impetus is really the Army Corps of Engineers, which is involved on so many different projects
Well,
involving the
I'll
oil and
throw another
gas
one in there.
industry. Go ahead.
I'll throw another one in there because of the Army Corps. Yeah, you have to look at FEMA as well as another
Yeah.
one that can fit into that block, which is probably a department that's going to get completely rebranded and relaunched as something that actually works for disasters and in case of emergencies, because it hasn't for the last several decades.
So the one that I wanted to ask you about, and more from an ag energy, we were talking about John Deere, you were talking about Summit Carbon Solutions, we're talking about ethanol now that is tying itself to the oil and gas industry and the coal industry. And Brooke Rollins, she's from Texas, grew up in Minnesota, big part of 4-H and Future Farmers of America. She worked for Rick Perry, who you're seeing on social media pics throughout the interweb. A picture of you and a Rick Perry or two when he was in North Dakota. You got to meet him. And
He was in Bismarck, yeah.
yep. And so, she worked for Rick Perry. So obviously she has an energy background. She actually has an ag background. It's going to be interesting because the ag and energy industry is tying itself together more than ever, whether it's through the carbon bond or whether it's through ethanol or whether it's through the fact that people are starting to realize that the ag industry and the energy industry, specifically the oil and gas industry, really are hand in hand together. So, Brooke Rollins is her name. She's the Secretary of Agriculture. We're used to names like Vilsack and Ed Schaefer, Steve. So this is kind of a little bit different for people like you and me who have interviewed mostly male ag secretaries throughout our careers.
It's interesting because the affiliation to 4-H and FFA and those youth groups that bring the younger generations into agriculture, I question which I'm a little hopeful someone with her background working with the youth, because we've been seeing this for a long time now in states like North Dakota. What is the future of agriculture for young people? Because if you're not the one or two kids that could stay on the family farm or ranch, where's your opportunity? Because most of them can't afford land. You're not going to be able to afford the $1.5 million combine. It's expensive to get into agriculture, and the payout hasn't been that good. And I'll pick on ethanol a little bit because that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. But when you're looking at tying yourself from a subsidy perspective and a mandate, people will go, well, they took all the subsidies. Yeah, but it's still mandated. A mandate is a subsidy. If it's mandated to be in something, it's being subsidized. So if you take a look at the ethanol industry and where they have hitched their wagon to, and they've all gotten really fat off of ethanol subsidies and the mandates with fuel, but you have to look at some of the unintended consequences. And I think this was an unintended consequence because nobody looked at this. If you recall back when the first discussion about ethanol was coming up, it's like, it was, well, should we be making ethanol out of switchgrass or should we be making ethanol out of something else? And the Corn Association, the corn growers stepped up and like, nope, we'll do it because they saw the dollars. Okay, but what we're getting into now is a situation where over the last 20 years, prices, land prices have priced out, equipment prices have priced out anybody new, any new generation, new blood getting into the industry. That's just where we're at right now. And I think that's an unintended consequence of ethanol. What we're seeing right now is also look at all of the cattle producers that are selling off their herds. The US cattle stock right now is the lowest it's been since 1951. And we were still coming off the heels trying to rebuild stocks after World War II. That's not a good situation to be in because everybody talks about egg prices. I'm more worried about beef prices right now. And I don't buy my beef at the store. I buy from a producer locally sourced. And what you're seeing a lot of people paying right now is $4 hanging weight. That's insane. Well, a lot of producers are selling off their herds because they have to take that dollar. But the other piece of this, and this is the part where growing food for fuel makes 0 sense. A lot of them can't afford the feed prices, hence the reason they're selling off their stock. So what happens when we don't have the supply? Well, the price goes up. And we're seeing that it's incrementally inching up right now, and it has been over the last couple of years. And people want to blame COVID. I'll point my finger right at corn. I will point it right at ethanol. We're seeing some very bad things in the agriculture world, in the ranching sectors, because of producing fuel with food. And some of those are unintended consequences. And because I want to have faith in people and say that's not because some people are just trying to be greedy and take the dollars, but it's getting harder and harder to have faith. It really is. But that's what we're seeing from an agriculture perspective because of ethanol. So having somebody in a position where they understand, and probably a little bit more so, the difficulties of that next generation and the generation after that getting into the ag sector in farming and ranching, I'm very hopeful and very optimistic that we can start looking at reversing some of those trends.
So the fuel yield per gallon, according to a study done a number of years ago, sugar beets out of France yield the most at
Yeah.
714. Sugar cane out of Brazil at 662. Cassava out of Nigeria at 410, I believe. Is that like a potato? Is that anyway?
Uh, yeah, so it's a
Yeah, it's like a tuber, right?
yeah,
Anyway,
it's a tuber.
sweet sorghum in India at 374, corn in the U.S. at 354, and wheat in France at 277. So, it's interesting when you mentioned the switchgrass because I remember, of course, North Dakota State was very heavy into the switchgrass research and some of those different things. I want to say there was a Jerusalem artichoke that was involved in one of the research studies somewhere, either in Minnesota or North Dakota. And the Jerusalem artichoke, for example, was getting some great success
Well,
stories. But you're kind of like mentioning about how the corn growers stepped up and said, "We'll take the money. We're a great place where you can direct it to," and it's it is what it is, you know. I mean, it's a decision that was made in a direction that was gone, and now where we're at today is the ethanol industry and the oil and gas industry really are like tying themselves together, Steve. Did you expect that to happen in a way where they're kind of saying that we need this subsidy in order for our industries to survive? It's kind of a little bit taken off guard in my world.
Well, part of it's coming from the overlap. I mean, you've got ag producers that are in the energy business, and you've got energy producers which are by default in the ag business because the commonality in all of that is what? Carbon, building block of life. You know, if we don't have CO2, plants don't grow. If now where we've really gotten into the some more synergy in that is like, hey, we can use all this CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Well, but now it's funny that you say that they've kind of married themselves to each other, but shouldn't they be competing for the same commodity? Because I look at CO2 as a commodity and it's valuable, whether it's in the beer you drink or the pop you drink or for medical purposes. Medical grade CO2, pure CO2, it's $150 a liter. Well, when you have an abdominal surgery, what do you think they pump you full of? It's not air, it's medical grade CO2. There's a market for all of that, and we're at a deficit in the market space. So um, I think they should be actually competing against each other, but now you're talking about sequestering something, sticking it in the ground. That's something that's very valuable that we desperately need. I'm not sure where that makes sense, but yeah, you're right. I mean, they've tied themselves to each other, but I think it's because of some of the overlap and it's more about, well, yeah, we're kind of competing, but we're trying to get to the same place from a subsidy perspective or from getting our hands on the resource perspective. So, I can show you study after study of some of these ethanol plants, uh, the ones that don't locally sequester their CO2 for the credits. Take a look at the yields downwind. Corn crop's better. Wonder why? Those plants need the CO2.
Funny how it lines up like that, huh? With the plant food known as CO2. I've seen
Well,
it out in the Bakken with my own two
it was
eyes with
funny.
some of the areas where they flare. There's a lot
Yeah.
of life around there.
Well, and it's funny too because Texas A&M did some studies back in the early teens, and they were doing some work on the damage caused from a blowout. So they were misting cropland with a fine mist of petroleum. So they were replicating if there was a well blowout, and then studying and how the best way to clean that up is. What they were finding was that mist of oil bound moisture into the soil. They have better crops because you got to remember, petroleum is organic. It's not like you're spraying a chemical over cropland in moderation. It's organic, naturally comes out of the earth, but that oil was retaining moisture in arid soil, so they were having better cropland. It's like they were not expecting that from those studies, but it was kind of a wow, epiphany moment here.
Well, Steve, any other cabinet members that you want to mention at all as we kind of wrap up here that stand out, whether somebody we've named and we didn't mention on something that might be pertinent? You know, of course, you mentioned as a former mayor and current Burley County Commissioner, the Department of Transportation was one that, stands out a little bit.
It's going to be huge.
And
It's going to be huge.
yeah, and one of the reasons I wanted to mention is that when you're dealing with pipelines, there's a growth plate that's involved with cities. And sometimes it can be a 10-year, 15-year, 20-year, 100-year build out. It just depends on where that growth plate is necessarily marked at and what the markers are. Describe a little bit about how that process works because that becomes a little bit complex. That's one of the issues in Bismarck that first sparked the Summit Carbon Solutions was that it was going to run right through a growth plate with the city. So this is why these department heads are extremely important because they can impact a city like, a state capital for crying out loud. So just talk to me a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, and it comes back to long-term planning. Stop looking at where we are today and look at where we need to be. And I try to do that a lot. When I was mayor, we were going through our new um, long-term strategic plan, and the staff wanted to go out 5 years. I'm like, well, by the time we get this done, it's going to be three. And what good is that? I bumped it out to 2045. And it's going to change a lot before you ever get anywhere near that. But if you're not trying to identify where you need to be that far out, you're really far behind the eight ball. So in Bismarck's case, where Summit was going because of the setbacks and the danger associated with that pipeline and how you can future develop that land adjacent to it or downwind of where it goes, it was going to choke Bismarck off. And I mean that metaphorically, not literally. Uh, but the growth plate for Bismarck is to the east and to the north, and it was going to disrupt where that growth could be. I mean, Bismarck's got the Missouri River to the west, and it's cut off to the south by floodplain in the river. I mean, there's only two ways to grow, and that was going to impede that. That's part of the long-term planning. That's why strategic planning is important. Municipalities are required to do that, and for good reason. It just doesn't always go out far enough. And I think one of the things that gets overlooked is you put these things, these information pieces in the hands of local jurisdictions and local control. And then when a project like Summit Carbon Solution pops up for not the betterment of the communities that are involved, but for pure profit, you forego all that planning and that local intellect, that local knowledge base, because uh, company comes in, or even on the state level, they don't know what that local plan is. They don't ask. They've never consulted and go, hey, what's the long-term strategic plan for your community? What is that? That needs to be part of the process. If you're looking at doing a capital project, whether privately or um, for the greater good, then you need to look at that local piece and go back to that local control issue and go, okay, what do you guys know that we don't? What do we need to know? And how does this fit into your long-term plans?
All right, last one, Linda McMahon. She's with the Department of Education, and it's it is actually very important with the oil and gas industry specifically because I believe they fund about half of the education system in every state where the oil and gas industry is
Mhm.
active. Okay, so um, somebody might say, "Oh, well, he's just bringing up Linda McMahon because it's WrestleMania season, and
She is going to lay
she
some smackdown.
and
She
and
will lay
and
some smackdown.
right, and she used to know, be with all my heroes like Jake the Snake and Randy Macho Man Savage and all my heroes as a kid, right? Well, they'd be right. I'm not going to say anything bad about her. Are you kidding me? Not at all. But you're very passionate about education. You understand how much money the oil and gas industry in North Dakota gives through taxes to the education industry, if you will.
Well,
Um,
one further than that,
yeah, go ahead.
beyond just the taxes, it's the production side too, because the way North Dakota's set up on the education piece, we've got school trust lands, and the mineral royalties that come off of some of those properties that are drilled are quite sizable. They are sitting on a huge amount of wealth in the state of North Dakota because of those school trust lands. So it's just set aside in every section, belongs to basically education in the state of North Dakota. So, yeah, there's a lot of money. It's not just the tax dollars involved with that.
And so, looking at what she's going to bring to the education sector, the education spectrum space, like I said, you actually have some passion with it on areas outside of the oil and gas industry. For me, I've got my, of course, education background. My son went through the Montessori system. I believe in the audio, the visual, the kinesthetic, which is role playing, hands-on type learning as a foundational base when it comes to a child. Common Core became like a big part of the education system. And so there's so many different ways that people view how to educate. Linda McMahon coming in, talk to me a little bit about your views on what you'd like to see from Linda McMahon when it comes to education.
Well, a lot of people forget that she actually was in President Trump's previous administration as well. So
Small
she's got a,
business administrator.
yep, she's got a great working relationship with the president. And I think they've made no bones about the fact that they would like to see the education department dissolved on the federal level and go back locally. And I think that's a great opportunity for states to not only recraft education, but get our kids back up to the standards that we are waning in developed countries around the globe. United States used to be a leader in education. Um, Ironically, as soon as the Department of Education came to fruition, that's when it started deteriorating. So going back to local control and the local aspect of letting the states set up their own education, I think would be very good for North Dakota, but it'd be good for everybody. It'd be good for every state. Um, I'm not quite sure how some states would navigate that, but that's up to them locally. Um, the other piece to the educational side is, our former DPI, Department of Public Instruction, who runs K-12, pre-K-12 education here in North Dakota, is now uh, in Washington within the administration. Um, I think that's going to be beneficial for North Dakota, and that's going to be um, interesting to see how that plays out if the Department of Education winds up going away. Fortunately, we're kind of at an epiphany moment here in North Dakota because our governor is a big proponent of education, our new governor, and he's in favor of some of the alternative education pieces that have been out there that we haven't seen in North Dakota before, and there's been a pretty good fight against. I'm a big believer that the dollar should follow the kids. There should be other options for parents instead of just sending your kid to a private school and paying twice. Because if you are sending your kid to a private school, you're paying your taxes for education, you're paying your fees for going to that private school. There's vouchers or whatever. Figure out how to make sure that works so that kids are getting a good education in any manner that that parent decides best for their family or their learning opportunities for their child, because kids learn differently. All kids learn a little differently, and you have to figure out what the combination is to get them in the best situation to succeed. And fortunately, we've got a governor that's in favor of some of those other options. And that comes back to the local piece, bringing things back to the family. Um, you know, Families should be raising kids, not the state, not the feds, not the education system, families. And those decisions should be there.
Steve Bakken, thanks for your time today, Burleigh County Commissioner. We'll have you on again after your next. Oh, by the way, anything happened in session today that we should know about?
No, back at it today. So after crossover here in North Dakota, the big news is down in South Dakota. Um, block the CO2 pipeline and the eminent domain stuff. There's some jockeying going around that. I was up at the Capitol today for a while, and there was actually a little bit of a buzz about what South Dakota did. Because there was a lot of legislators that were buying into our previous governor's position on sequestration of CO2 here in North Dakota. And we'll have to wait and see, but it was kind of interesting today.
All right,
Very
overtime.
interesting. And by the way, I am going to Washington, D.C. We should probably visit afterwards as a guest to meet with lawmakers in the capacity of an elected official that's dealing with the Summit Carbon Solutions pipeline and CO2 sequestration. So,
Oh, going to DC to meet with us now. Okay, well, fantastic. Yeah, we'll have to track that and also follow it a little bit more. But I did want to just be kind, rewind. And you mentioned that South Dakota had blocked or a measure or something. Explain just, do kind of an elevator pitch on it, just an overview of what was the bill and why is it significant?
so basically, it's property owner rights. And we've had, and our previous governor had killed um, several attempts to strengthen private property ownership here in North Dakota. And basically, what we've come up with is it was because of Summit Carbon Solutions project, and South Dakota got in the way of that. Going back to their June primaries, there were a lot of elected officials in South Dakota that were in favor of giving the pass through for Summit and their pipeline project. And a lot of those officials were primaried, and a lot of other officials got the message that private property rights matter. What you do on your property and what you can do with your property matters. And if you think about it, if we don't have private property rights in this country, what do we have? Serf system, you know, servitude, indentured. It's there's a reason that we had a revolution to kind of get away from some of that. And South Dakota was at that point, and they had a little revolution in June, and it's followed through. And I'm a little disappointed in North Dakota that there hasn't been the same appetite to the same degree that South Dakota, our neighbor to the south, has had.
The beginning, the beginning, if you will, the mouth is Iowa, correct, for this
Correct.
pipeline? And then the terminus or the foot, the end is North Dakota. You're the Burleigh
Correct.
County, Oliver County,
Oliver County.
Oliver
Yeah.
County, Morton County.
No, Oliver McHenry.
Okay,
Depending
just
on the latest map you
yeah.
look at, there may have been a little piece in Morton, but
Okay, so part of it was supposed to go through South Dakota because there are there are ethanol plants
ethanol
that are
plant
attached to it. And then there's going to be a little bit of a wing going through Minnesota and then a kind of
to pick up one plant.
well, there's some down in southern Minnesota now. And then there's the Fergus
Oh, they added
Falls
those? Okay.
plant. Yeah, the Fergus Falls plant that goes directly over to the Wahpeton, South Dakota, North Dakota border area. So my question to you is kind of a ridiculous question because I mean, honestly, I'm not even sure if this was a real text or not, but I'm part of a text chain. And last night when I got the text that this happened in South Dakota, there was another text that mentioned that they have a backup plan to route through Nebraska, basically route around South Dakota and kind of connect in through Wyoming and back around. And when I read that text, first thing I thought is, okay, they're being sarcastic. And then the second thing I
Well,
thought of is that's the way I used to play Dig Dug. So is that real? Like, is that a backup plan or is that just a sarcastic text?
I think it is, because if you take a look at Tallgrass Energy and some of the positioning they have done, um, yeah, it looks like that is going to be the alternative. Now, not to be selfish, because the bigger picture is this is a bad idea anyway, but then North Dakota would more than likely be off the table as the final destination. It would wind up being Wyoming.
Okay.
And when Wyoming winds up, they'll take anything for a dollar. So, um, under the guise of energy, it's just kind of the way the
Hmm.
makeup of that state is. Um, you know, I have little mixed emotions on that because it's still a bad project. It's a for it's a private business for profit at the sakes of private property rights. Uh, they have less entanglements in Nebraska because there's not a public service commission. That's what we have in North Dakota, or a public utilities commission in South Dakota. It's called something else in Iowa, but they don't have one. So when it comes to siting pipelines, it's easier to get the eminent domain piece done uh, in Nebraska. So the one thing I will say is there's a Nebraska resident that you and I both know, Trent Luce, that I think somebody paraphrased the other day that, well, I'd like to see that because if they go through Nebraska, he'll be selling pay-per-view tickets on it because he'll have the Nebraska folks fired up. Um, so it'll be interesting to see what transpires in the wake of South Dakota. Now, I haven't heard of any workarounds that they've been trying to attempt in South Dakota as of yet, but I'm sure there's another contingency for the South Dakota piece.
Well, the governor still has to sign it, correct?
Right, and I'm not sure it's veto proofed with
They they
their
might
margin.
sell pay-per-view whether he signs it or not.
Yeah,
And I'll tell
but
you
I
what,
will
they would
guarantee there's
sell a
going to be
lot
a
of tickets.
yeah, there's going to be a lot of other politicians out of office if the governor does not sign that and it has to go back to a veto and if it's not veto proof.
If Linda McMahon was in charge, it would be on NBC Saturday night, the signing or not, and we would have packages leading up. Oh man, I'm telling you, she's already underutilized. She's already underutilized. So
I
anyway,
think
but
Bobby Kennedy should be using her a little bit more in some of her skill set over in DHS.
that's a good point, and I'm going to be very curious to see how long Bobby Kennedy lasts. Whether he gets button some heads or just his policies get a little bit too extreme or what the deal is. But he's definitely I'm a huge fan of his. I'm a huge fan of his integrity, and at least from what I've seen, I guess. And curious to see how he's going to do. I have no idea, but like I said, he'll probably be the first one gone because he's kind of he's the one that goes the opposite way of Trump, but him and Trump are such good buddies that, it's hard to know.
I think there's an element of mutual respect and appreciation between those two. So he might last longer than you think.
Exactly. I mean, he might be the most successful one. And that's what makes him so interesting is that he's the one that I think is probably going to bring the most significant change when it's all said and done. But that's, involving our health and a few other things. And I have no idea how it's going to impact, on a lot of different ways on some of the
Well,
things he's looking at banning and some of the
well,
different
it's
directions.
interesting too because you take a look at the Linda McMahon and Kennedy connection because of education and Department of Health and Human Services, and where they have a lot of overlap is what's going on with transgendered athletes, males, biological males playing in women's sports, and I think that's an area that they're going to wind up working together.
Boy, it's going to be very interesting the next 4 years. Probably the most interesting 4 years in the history of this cabinet, Steve. And we got a front row seat, really, with Doug Burgum there and Chris Wright and Kathleen Skama. We didn't even get into her with the Bureau of Land Management. I mean, there's a few people that have been regulars on your program and my program, and a few mutual friends. You mentioned Trent Luce, and he, of course, is the Loose Tails host. He does Loose Tales, very popular radio program and podcast, Substack too as well. And Steve, he might end up being the next Sarah Stogner this year, the unicorn
Yeah.
lawyer. Of course, Sarah Stogner, the unicorn lawyer, went and took on the orphan well in the zombie wells across the United States, got all kinds of attention. She ran for the Texas Railroad Commission. She's now, I forget the county, but she's a district judge. She's trying to take it on because of her legal background, become more of a judiciary activist, if you will. I guess that's a real term you can use now. But I could see Trent Loos filling those shoes this year, being on the cover of New
Absolutely.
York Times with that big old mustache.
I want to see that.
All right, man. We'll catch you on the flip side, okay?
All right, later, my friend.